The Alpha's Human Mate, written by Short Story Queen. Chapter 1. The Man on the Road. The rain came down in sheets, the kind that blurred the world into watercolor. Harper Wells tightened her grip on the steering wheel, muttering about cursed country roads and her own questionable life choices. Somewhere between the empty highway and the forest line, a shape darted across her headlights. She hit the brakes hard enough to make the tires shriek. The truck skidded to a halt, heart pounding against silence. Then she saw him, a man sprawled in the middle of the road, barefoot, soaked, and breathing shallowly. For one stunned moment, Harper just stared. His skin was streaked with mud, his clothes torn like he'd been dragged through a battlefield. When his head turned slightly, she caught a glimpse of his eyes, amber, glowing faintly like a reflection of the storm's lightning. Her instincts warred with reason. It was late, and she was alone. But leaving him there felt unthinkable. Great, she muttered to herself, climbing out into the rain. This is how people die in horror movies. He was heavier than he looked, but somehow she managed to drag him into the truck. The second his skin touched hers, a strange jolt moved through her arm. Not pain, but something deep and unsettling, like a sound too low to hear. She ignored it. The man needed help, and she had no time for weird sensations or glowing eyes. The drive to her cabin took 10 minutes, though every second stretched. She talked to him just to keep herself calm, filling the silence with sarcastic rambling about bad weather, her unlucky timing, and how her sister Lydia would call her an idiot for picking up a stranger. He didn't respond, only breathed slowly, almost peacefully. Inside the cabin, she laid him on the couch. The fire she'd left smoldering earlier was nearly out, so she coaxed it back to life. The light fell over his face, revealing sharp, symmetrical features that didn't belong to a man who collapsed on rural roads. He looked expensive somehow, even covered in dirt, his jaw strong, his lashes long enough to make her feel personally offended. She fetched a towel and first aid kit. His pulse was steady, strong. A shallow cut ran across his ribs, already closing on its own. She blinked and leaned closer, wondering if she was just tired. The wound sealed like time was moving wrong. Harper sat back and pressed her fingers to her temples. "Right," she said softly. "Totally normal. People heal like superheroes all the time." The man stirred, his lips parted, voice rough and low. "Harper." She froze. The sound of her name in his mouth sent a shiver down her spine. "You're awake?" she asked, startled. But his eyes stayed closed, and the word seemed like a dream escaping him. She frowned. "You don't know my name, buddy," she whispered, "unless you read my wallet while dying, which would be rude." The absurdity of talking to an unconscious stranger finally hit her, and she laughed quietly to herself. Maybe Lydia's right. Maybe I am losing it. When she checked on him again a few minutes later, his breathing had evened out. Exhaustion pulled at her too, so she threw a blanket over him and retreated to her room, phone in hand, trying to call for help. The signal flickered uselessly. The storm had knocked everything out. She sighed, tossing the phone aside, unaware that in the next room, the man's eyes opened briefly, bright, unnatural gold, before fading back to human amber. Morning came late and gray. Harper woke to the smell of coffee that she definitely hadn't made. She stumbled into the kitchen, hair a nest, to find the stranger standing there, awake, dressed in a clean shirt she didn't own and looking infuriatingly composed. "Good morning," he said, voice low and smooth, as if making coffee in a stranger's house was entirely reasonable. Harper blinked. "You were unconscious in the rain on a road. I nearly hit you with my truck." He nodded, perfectly calm. "You didn't. Thank you." "Well," she said, crossing her arms, "you're welcome, but you owe me an explanation and probably a carpet cleaning." His mouth twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. "My name is Kellen Thorne. I was hiking. Got caught in the storm." She eyed him. "Barefoot in November?" "It's complicated." "Right," she said, pouring herself coffee. "I bet it is." The conversation trailed into silence. He moved with quiet precision, every motion measured, like someone used to control. The air around him felt charged, not threatening exactly, but intense enough to make her heart forget its rhythm for a second. She hated that. He was too calm for a man who'd supposedly collapsed on the highway. "So, Kellen," she said, setting down her mug, "where exactly were you hiking? Because unless you enjoy getting lost in private property, you were about 10 miles from the nearest trail." He hesitated, and something flickered in his expression, something old, guarded. "I was tracking someone." Harper raised an eyebrow. "What are you, a park ranger?" "Something like that." The way he said it ended the conversation without needing to raise his voice. Harper recognized that tone. It was the same one her late father used when talking about subjects that weren't up for debate. She decided not to push it. Still, part of her wondered what kind of man spoke like he commanded armies and made coffee like he'd been doing it for a century. He stayed at the cabin through the afternoon while the storm cleared. Every time she looked at him, that faint pull returned, like gravity had shifted in his direction. She tried to dismiss it as attraction. He was objectively gorgeous and she wasn't blind, but it felt heavier than that. Too instinctive. Too familiar. When Lydia called that evening, Harper lied, saying she was alone, because explaining she'd taken in a mysterious forest man sounded insane even for her. Yet as she hung up, she caught Kellen's reflection in the window. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching the forest, jaw clenched, body still, as if listening to something she couldn't hear. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint echo of a howl. It rose and fell, distant yet sharp enough to raise goosebumps. Harper glanced at him. "Wolves?" "Just the wind," he said too quickly. Later, when she finally went to bed, she told herself she'd drive him to town in the morning, drop him off and forget all about it. But sleep wouldn't come. Every sound outside made her restless. She dreamed of golden eyes in the rain, and somewhere between waking and dreaming, she heard a voice she couldn't name whisper through the dark. "Mine." She woke with the sunrise cutting through the curtains and the unsettling thought that her life had quietly changed while she wasn't looking. Chapter 2. The Stranger Who Stayed. By morning, the storm had softened into mist, the kind that clung to the windows and blurred the line between forest and sky. Harper moved through the kitchen with cautious curiosity, half expecting to find her mysterious guest gone. But there he was, standing at the counter as if he'd lived there forever, barefoot, steady, and quietly folding a dish towel. The smell of coffee drifted through the cabin, rich and annoyingly comforting. Harper lingered by the doorway, still not sure whether to thank him or call the police. He looked up before she could speak, that same composed calm flickering in his amber eyes. He had an unnerving way of making stillness look deliberate, like every breath belonged exactly where he put it. The conversation was brief, polite, and utterly strange. He thanked her again for helping him and offered to fix the broken gutter outside as repayment. She told him not to worry, though secretly she couldn't decide if she was more intrigued or irritated by his manners. Who nearly dies on a highway and then volunteers for home maintenance? When she went to the cafe later that day, her mind kept drifting back to him. The image of him standing in her kitchen, shirt slightly rumpled, voice low and sure. It lingered in ways she didn't like admitting. Lydia, of course, noticed immediately. Her younger sister's radar for emotional chaos was unmatched. "You're distracted," Lydia said while icing cupcakes. "You've got that look, the one you had when you found that stray dog and tried to pretend you weren't in love with it." Harper rolled her eyes. "He's just strange. I picked him up after the storm. He's staying for a bit." Lydia froze mid-icing. "You brought home a strange man from the woods? Do you at least know if he has a job? A pulse? A last name?" "He's fine," Harper muttered. Though even as she said it, she realized how absurd it sounded. Lydia began listing possibilities. Cult member, escaped convict, vampire, with a kind of enthusiasm only a caffeine addict could maintain. Harper tuned her out, staring instead at the line of trees beyond the cafe windows. When she returned home, Kellen was outside fixing the gutter, sleeves rolled to his elbows, movements precise and graceful. For a fleeting moment, she simply watched him. The sunlight caught his hair, gold and bronze at once, and she felt something unfamiliar in her chest. A tug, quiet but insistent. He noticed her watching. "I hope you don't mind," he said, without looking down from the roof. "You mentioned it was broken." "Not at all," she replied quickly, clearing her throat. "Though I'm starting to suspect you're just trying to work off your mysterious forest guy guilt." His mouth curved slightly. "Maybe." It wasn't a real smile, but it lingered long enough to be disarming. She retreated inside before her cheeks betrayed her. As evening settled, she caught herself humming while cooking dinner. It had been a long time since she'd shared her space with anyone. The cabin suddenly felt warmer, though she refused to admit why. She served 2 bowls of soup, pretending it was an act of charity and not domestic impulse. They ate mostly in silence. Every now and then he'd glance up, eyes unreadable, as if studying her. She tried not to notice the way he handled his spoon like someone unfamiliar with casual gestures. When she joked about it, he tilted his head, almost amused, like he was trying to remember what laughing felt like. After dinner, Harper insisted he take the spare room. He nodded in quiet gratitude but didn't move immediately. Instead, he studied her, like she was something fragile and important. "You shouldn't have stopped that night," he said quietly. "It could have been dangerous." She shrugged, folding her arms. "So could leaving you there." Something flickered behind his eyes. Respect, or maybe surprise. "You're brave," he said finally. "I'm reckless," she corrected, half smiling. "There's a difference." When she turned away, she didn't see the faintest trace of gold ripple through his gaze, or the way his fingers flexed slightly, as if restraining something deeper. Later that night, Harper lay awake listening to the wind whisper through the trees. Every creak of the floorboards made her pulse quicken. She told herself it was because she wasn't used to having company. But part of her knew that wasn't it. There was something about him, something just beyond reason, like gravity pulling at the edges of her world. In the guest room, Kellen stood by the window, eyes fixed on the forest. The faint sound of distant howls carried through the mist. His wolf-stirred, restless whispering through the mind link he kept severed from the pack. "She doesn't know what you are. She should. She's ours." Kellen closed his eyes, breathing through the ache of it. "Not yet," he answered silently. "She's not ready." The wolf's response was low and impatient, more emotion than word. He ignored it, watching the lights of the cafe flicker faintly in the distance. Humans weren't meant to be tangled in the ways of alphas. And yet, when Harper's laughter had drifted from the kitchen earlier, something inside him had settled for the first time in years. Morning came quietly. Harper woke to find a small note on the table in clean, deliberate handwriting. "Fix the fence. Don't go out alone after dark." She laughed under her breath. "Bossy," she murmured, shaking her head. But when she opened the door, the scent of pine and rain carried something else. A trace of him that lingered in the air long after he'd gone to the woods. It shouldn't have mattered. He was just a stranger, a man she'd rescued out of misplaced compassion. And yet, as she stepped out into the cool morning light, she couldn't help but feel like she was walking into a story that had already begun without her. Chapter 3. The Pull of the Moon. The week passed in quiet rhythm, a kind of uneasy peace that neither Harper nor Kellen seemed ready to disturb. He stayed longer than planned, though he never said why. The excuse changed each morning. Repairs to finish, supplies delayed, the road too muddy for travel. But the truth lay in the way he lingered near her cafe window each evening, his gaze following her without meaning to. Harper noticed, of course, it was hard not to. The man had the subtlety of a thundercloud, and the posture of a soldier pretending to be a tourist. Still, she told herself it was harmless. She was used to people drifting in and out of her life. Travelers, customers, the occasional lost hiker. But no one had ever looked at her like he did. Not with hunger exactly, but with an intensity that made her pulse skip and her sarcasm sharpen as defense. The cafe had become his unofficial territory. He sat in the corner seat every morning, reading a battered notebook, occasionally helping fix broken chairs or stubborn coffee machines without being asked. The regulars adored him, though they whispered about his strange quietness and the way animals went still when he walked by. Lydia loved him instantly, of course, convinced he was a forest ranger or maybe an undercover movie star. "Maybe he's researching for a role," she told Harper one afternoon, wiping down the counter. "You know, rugged man learns to feel again through the power of caffeine and baked goods." Harper rolled her eyes, pretending not to smile. "Right. He's definitely the emotional type. Probably cries at sunsets." Yet that evening, when she locked up and found him outside repairing the cafe sign that had been broken for months, she felt a strange warmth spread through her chest. He didn't say anything when she thanked him, just nodded and offered one of those fleeting half-smiles that always felt like more than they should. They fell into an unspoken pattern. She teased, he tolerated. She joked, he almost laughed. Sometimes when she caught his expression softening mid-conversation, she'd feel that same electric hum she'd felt the night she found him. She brushed it off, pretending it was curiosity and not something dangerous. But there were moments, brief and disorienting, when she sensed something else beneath his calm. His eyes would flick toward the tree line, his body going perfectly still, as if hearing a sound she couldn't. Once she found him outside at midnight, standing shirtless under the silver wash of the moon, breathing like he was trying to contain something vast. She'd frozen in the doorway, torn between fascination and alarm. He hadn't seen her, but the sight of him, barefoot, shoulders tense, eyes glinting faint gold, haunted her dreams for nights afterward. The next morning, Lydia noticed the dark circles under Harper's eyes. "So, when are you confessing your tragic love for our mystery handyman?" she asked, pouring herself far too much sugar into her coffee. Harper snorted. "There's no love, tragic or otherwise. He's just staying until the road's clear." "Uh-huh. And I'm the queen of the forest," Lydia said. "Face it, you've got the hots for him. It's fine. He's like illegal levels of attractive." Harper muttered something about sisters being the worst invention in human history, but Lydia's grin didn't fade. She'd always been able to see through Harper's defenses, which was exactly why Harper avoided eye contact and buried herself in work. That evening, Harper found Kellen fixing the porch railing again. It was already perfectly fine, but she didn't mention it. Instead, she leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, pretending she wasn't watching, the way the muscles in his arms shifted with every movement. "You know," she said, "most guests say thank you and leave. You're setting dangerous precedents." "I don't mind," he said simply. His calmness unsettled her. He never flirted, never pushed, but his silence carried weight, like he was letting her come closer at her own pace. When she handed him a glass of lemonade, their fingers brushed, and that familiar spark flared between them again. This time, neither looked away. For a heartbeat, the world felt too still. Then Lydia's voice echoed from inside, asking if anyone had seen her phone charger for the 10th time that day, and the moment cracked like glass. Harper stepped back quickly, mumbling something about dishes, while Kellen turned toward the forest, jaw tightening. Later, when Harper locked the cafe for the night, she found Kellen waiting by the truck. The moon had risen, full and heavy. He seemed tense, shadows cutting along his cheekbones. "Don't go walking alone after dark," he said quietly. "I've lived here my whole life. The worst thing in these woods is a raccoon with anger issues." "Still," he said, gaze steady on hers, "promise me." The seriousness in his tone unsettled her. She nodded despite herself. He gave a small nod of approval and disappeared into the trees like the night itself swallowed him. Hours later, Harper lay awake again. The forest outside hummed with sounds she couldn't name, low, distant, and almost rhythmic. Curiosity won over reason. She slipped on her coat and stepped outside, following the faint silver glow of moonlight across the clearing. The woods felt alive, humming under her feet. Then she saw movement. a shadow, darting between trees. For a second she thought it was an animal, but then the shape straightened, unmistakably human. Kellen. He stood half-lit by moonlight, his shirt discarded, the pale gleam of his skin almost unreal. His body trembled, muscles tense as though containing invisible fire. The air around him shimmered faintly. His head snapped up, eyes flashing gold. Harper froze. The sound that followed was low and guttural, not quite human, not quite beast. Before fear could take root, Kellen turned and vanished into the darkness, faster than any man could move. She stood there long after he was gone, heart thudding, breath shallow. Somewhere deep down, a truth she didn't want to believe began to unfurl. When she returned to the cabin, Lydia was asleep on the couch, snoring softly. Harper sank into a chair, staring out the window at the tree line. The echo of that golden gaze burned into her mind. Whatever Kellen Thorne was, he wasn't just a lost hiker. And no matter how much she wanted to pretend otherwise, she wasn't sure she wanted to know the truth. But beneath her confusion, beneath the flicker of fear, something warmer stirred, a reckless, impossible pull toward the man who made the night itself hold its breath. Chapter 4. The Secret Beneath the Skin. Morning came too bright for Harper's fragile sense of denial. The first thing she saw when she opened her eyes was sunlight creeping through the blinds, slicing across her messy kitchen. The second was Kellen, very much human again, sitting at her table with a cup of coffee like nothing remotely strange had happened in the woods the night before. He looked maddeningly composed, hair damp, clean shirt clinging to him just enough to make her brain short-circuit. She wanted to march over and demand an explanation, but part of her suspected he'd just stare at her with that infuriating calm and somehow make her feel ridiculous for asking. Instead, she shuffled in wearing mismatched socks and yesterday's sweater, muttering something about coffee being sacred. He glanced up as if he'd been waiting for her. "You were outside last night," he said quietly. Her hand froze on the mug. She wasn't sure whether to lie or throw him out. "I couldn't sleep," she said finally, though her voice betrayed her. He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering behind his gaze, then returned to his coffee. "The forest isn't safe on nights like that," he murmured. "You don't say," she replied, unable to help herself. Between the howling and the mysterious men turning into Olympic sprinters, I was getting that impression. He almost smiled, the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth, as though her sarcasm amused him more than it should. That, more than anything, disarmed her. How was she supposed to stay irritated at someone who looked like an apology wrapped in broad shoulders? Lydia burst in before Harper could press the issue, wearing pajama pants and holding a phone like a weapon. "Okay, don't panic," she began, which of course meant Harper immediately did. "But there's a rumor going around town that wolves were spotted near the cafe last night." Harper glanced at Kellen, who remained perfectly neutral, which only made him look guiltier. Lydia, oblivious, continued rambling about local gossip and possible werewolf sightings, clearly thrilled by her own conspiracy. Harper wanted to crawl under the table and stay there forever. After Lydia left to spread chaos elsewhere, Harper leaned against the counter and sighed. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" He looked up at her with quiet seriousness. "I told you the forest isn't safe." That wasn't an answer, and they both knew it, but the way he said it, soft, protective, like every word weighed something, made her chest tighten unexpectedly. Whatever he was hiding, it wasn't out of malice, she could feel that. And maybe that scared her most of all. She decided to distract herself with work, but the day was useless. Every time the cafe bell rang, she half expected him to appear. When he finally did, just before sunset, she pretended not to notice the way her pulse jumped. He ordered black coffee like always, sat in his corner, and quietly repaired a broken chair leg she hadn't asked him to fix. Lydia stopped wiping tables long enough to whisper, "You know, if you don't marry him, I will." "Please don't," Harper muttered. "I'm pretty sure you'd explode from his silence alone." But the truth was, she couldn't stop watching him either. There was something magnetic about his stillness, like he was listening to a world no one else could hear. Every time he looked at her, even briefly, it felt like gravity changed direction. That night after closing, she found him waiting by her truck again. The air was cool, thick with the scent of pine and rain. He said nothing at first, just studied her face as though searching for something he couldn't name. "You shouldn't walk home alone," he said finally. She crossed her arms, feigning nonchalance. "And what exactly do you think is going to attack me? The world's most aggressive raccoon?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer. Close enough that she could see the faint gold halo flicker in his eyes when the streetlight hit them. The moment stretched, quiet, and strangely charged. Her breath caught, but she refused to look away. "I just want you safe," he said softly, and then he was gone, melting back into the trees, as if the forest itself claimed him. That night, Harper sat awake again, her mind a storm. Every instinct screamed that something about him wasn't normal, but beneath that unease was curiosity, and beneath curiosity was the strange, unwelcome ache of missing him. By morning, she'd almost convinced herself it was infatuation mixed with sleep deprivation. She opened the cafe early, needing distraction, only to find the entire pack of elderly regulars whispering about fresh paw prints near the fence. Lydia was photographing them for her blog, naturally, while Kellen stood nearby, expression unreadable. When their eyes met, she raised an eyebrow in challenge, daring him to deny it. To her surprise, he didn't. He just gave her that quiet look again, half apology, half confession, and said, "Sometimes the wild gets closer than we expect." Lydia squealed that it was poetic and suspicious, but Harper could barely hear her. The words lingered long after he left, and for the first time, she realized she wasn't afraid of his secrets. She was afraid of how much she wanted to be part of them. That evening, she walked the familiar path toward her cabin, moonlight soft through the pines. The world felt different now, alive, listening. Somewhere in the distance, she thought she heard a howl rise, low and mournful, before fading into silence. Harper smiled to herself, shaking her head. "It's just the wind," she whispered, though the flutter in her chest told her she didn't believe it. And deep in the forest unseen, Kellen watched her go, his wolf restless beneath his skin. "She's not ready," he told himself again, even as every instinct screamed that she already belonged to him. Chapter 5. The Fence Between Us. The next morning arrived with a crisp, deceptive calm that felt too ordinary for the chaos Harper's mind was still untangling. She stood outside her cafe with a cup of coffee, staring at the forest as if the trees owed her answers. They swayed gently in the wind, giving nothing away. Somewhere beyond them, she knew Kellen was awake too, probably fixing something that didn't need fixing, probably thinking too much just like she was. By the time she drove home that evening, she had decided two things. First, she was absolutely not falling for a mysterious forest man who might or might not turn into a wolf under moonlight. Second, she was definitely falling for him anyway. Denial was easier when she had customers, but alone in her cabin, every silence felt filled with him, his voice, his eyes. The strange gravity that made her feel seen, in a way she hadn't felt in years. Her fence, however, had other plans. It had chosen that day to collapse in spectacular fashion, leaving a section of her backyard open to the woods. Harper glared at it, muttered a few unrepeatable words, and fetched her toolbox. She had barely picked up a hammer before a shadow fell over her shoulder. Kellen. He carried a roll of wire fencing like it weighed nothing, his shirt sleeves pushed up, hair tousled by the wind. He looked like he'd stepped straight out of one of Lydia's ridiculous romance novels. Only this one smelled faintly of pine and quiet authority. "Your fence was down," he said simply, setting to work without waiting for permission. Harper opened her mouth to protest, but there was something so absurdly capable about him, measuring posts, tying wire, moving with silent efficiency, that she just gave up. "Do you ever stop fixing things?" she asked finally. He looked up briefly, the ghost of a smile threatening to appear. "Only what's broken," Cute, she muttered, pretending not to blush. They worked side by side for the next hour. Or rather, he worked and she mostly passed him tools while trying to look useful. Every time their hands brushed, something small and electric jumped between them, subtle enough to make her question if it was real. The air between them felt charged in a way that wasn't entirely explainable by attraction. Lydia arrived halfway through with iced coffees and an arsenal of intrusive questions. "So," she began cheerfully, "are we doing manual labor together now? Is this like foreplay for people with tool belts?" Harper nearly dropped her hammer. "Please leave." Kellen kept working entirely unbothered, though Harper caught the slight twitch of his mouth. Lydia was too entertained to stop. "I'm just saying," she continued, sipping her drink, "this is exactly how those home renovation romances start. The brooding man with mysterious scars shows up to fix something, and the next thing you know, there's emotional healing and a kiss in the rain." Harper pointed toward the road. "Goodbye, Lydia." Her sister left only after snapping a few photos for memory. Harper groaned, while Kellen quietly tightened the last wire. The finished fence gleamed neatly in the late light. "Thank you," she said, exhaling. "I owe you dinner or something." He shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." "Well, too bad," she replied, hands on hips. "I'm cooking. Try to stop me." He didn't. He just watched her for a long moment, something soft and curious in his eyes, then nodded once. Dinner turned out better than expected, mostly because he insisted on helping. She discovered he could chop vegetables with alarming precision and made tea like it was a ritual. The two of them fell into a rhythm, wordless and strangely easy. Every now and then, she caught him glancing at her, and her heartbeat tripped over itself in protest. When they finally sat down, Lydia's words echoed annoyingly in her head. Maybe this really did look like one of those ridiculous romantic setups. The thought made her laugh under her breath. "What?" Kellen asked, his tone gentle. "Nothing," she said quickly. "Just thinking how strange this is. You fixing fences, me making dinner for a guy I found half dead on a road. It's not exactly the usual love story." He tilted his head, his voice quiet but steady. "Maybe the unusual ones last longer." The comment slipped into the air before either of them could pretend it wasn't intimate. For a heartbeat, they simply looked at each other, the silence warm instead of awkward. Harper felt something uncoil in her chest, slow and unfamiliar. When the dishes were done, Kellen stepped outside, his expression thoughtful. Harper followed, drawn by the cool night air and something else she didn't want to name. They stood by the repaired fence, the forest stretching out like a shadowed sea before them. "It's quiet tonight," she said softly. "For now," he answered, his gaze distant. "The forest changes before the full moon." She frowned, hearing the faintest tension in his voice. "You say that like you know it personally." He didn't reply right away. Instead, he looked at her the way one might look at a secret they weren't ready to share. "Some things are easier to understand from the inside," he said finally. The cryptic answer should have annoyed her, but instead she found herself smiling. "You really don't do normal conversation, do you?" His eyes glinted faintly in the moonlight. "I'm learning." That was enough to make her laugh, the sound spilling easily into the night. She didn't realize how close they were standing until the laughter faded and her breath hitched. The distance between them was barely a heartbeat. For a moment she thought he might move closer, but he didn't. He just looked at her like he was memorizing her face, then turned back toward the trees. "Good night, Harper," he said quietly. The words gentle but weighted. She watched him walk into the shadows, his figure merging with the dark until he was gone. Back inside, Harper leaned against the door and let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The repaired fence gleamed faintly through the window, solid and strong, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just the boundary between her yard and the forest. It was the fragile line between reason and something wild that was already calling her name. Chapter 6. The Things We Don't Say. The following days unfolded with an ease that felt both strange and fragile, like walking across thin ice without hearing it crack. Harper tried convincing herself that Kellen's presence was temporary, that once the forest dried and the roads cleared, he'd vanish as quietly as he had arrived. Yet every morning there he was, repairing something, drinking his black coffee in the same corner of the cafe, offering small nods instead of good mornings that somehow meant more. Her regulars adored him now. Old Mrs. Calloway started referring to him as Harper's lumberjack fiancé, and no amount of denial seemed to change her mind. Lydia encouraged it naturally, adding dramatic flourishes to the story whenever possible. Harper, meanwhile, tried to maintain her dignity, though it was difficult when Kellen's very existence turned her insides into static. He had that rare kind of quiet confidence, the kind that filled a room without a single word. The worst part was how effortlessly he fit into her routine. He'd fix a loose shelf before she noticed it was wobbly, refill the coffee beans when she was distracted, and vanish into the woods just when she started feeling brave enough to ask about him. One afternoon she caught him leaning against the cafe doorframe, sleeves rolled up, sunlight turning his hair the color of honey. He looked too comfortable, like he belonged there. That realization made her heart stumble. She dropped an entire tray of spoons in response. The clatter was deafening. He looked at her, amused but polite, as if waiting to see whether she'd laugh or combust. She chose the former, though the sound came out too high-pitched. Lydia, from across the counter, was grinning like a cat that had found the cream. By evening, Harper was pacing around her cabin, berating herself for acting like a lovesick teenager. She told herself she'd just talked to him, asked the questions that had been haunting her. But when he knocked on her door right after sunset, all intentions dissolved into chaos. He'd brought firewood, of course, always fixing, always helping. His eyes softened when he saw her expression, half nerves, half irritation at her own inability to stay composed. "You looked cold earlier," he said simply. "That's because it's winter, not a cry for help," she muttered, taking the wood from him. Her sarcasm, once a shield, now came out more as self-defense against how gently he looked at her. They ended up sharing dinner again, though neither had planned to. The meal was simple, soup and fresh bread, but the silence between them carried a current that kept Harper hyper-aware of every sound, every shift in the air. She asked about his work, his home, the vague idea of where he came from. His answers were honest but partial, like puzzle pieces without edges. She noticed how his eyes flickered away each time the topic veered too close to truth. Something in her wanted to push harder, but another part, quieter, softer, knew he'd tell her when he could. Instead, they spoke about small things, her cafe regulars, the best pie flavor, Lydia's hopeless matchmaking. At one point, Harper said something teasing about his expressionless calm, and finally, he laughed. It wasn't loud, but it was real, and it felt like the sound filled every corner of the room. It startled her how much she liked it. Outside, snow began to fall in soft, slow flakes. The world looked peaceful, almost unreal through the window. Harper found herself tracing patterns on the fogged glass while he watched her with quiet fascination. She wasn't used to being looked at like that, not as something fragile, but as something precious. When she turned back, their eyes met, and for a heartbeat the air between them felt too close, too fragile. He looked like he wanted to step closer but didn't. She looked like she might let him. Neither moved. The silence said everything. Words couldn't. Lydia chose that exact moment to call, shattering it spectacularly. Harper fumbled with the phone while Kellen smirked faintly, retreating to the fireplace. Lydia, of course, demanded an update on the romantic wilderness saga, which Harper denied through gritted teeth. When the call finally ended, Kellen was staring into the fire, his expression unreadable. "She worries about you," he said quietly. "She worries about everything," Harper replied, sitting beside him. "Mostly about my tragic taste in men." He gave a small sound of amusement low in his throat. The warmth between them deepened, not from the fire, but from something wordless that had been building since the storm. For a while they just sat there, the fire crackling softly. His presence filled the space like steady heartbeat rhythm, reassuring, unspoken. She wanted to ask what he was thinking, but feared the answer. Instead, she leaned her head back and whispered, "You don't talk much, do you?" He turned to her, eyes catching the light. Sometimes silence says more. And for once, she understood exactly what he meant. When he finally stood to leave, she followed him to the door. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. He hesitated, glancing back at her as though about to speak, but then only nodded once, a wordless promise of something neither of them could name yet. After he left, Harper lingered by the door, heart unsteady, smiling despite herself. Every sensible part of her knew she should be cautious, but every other part whispered that caution had already lost the fight. Somewhere beyond the woods, under the quiet glow of moonlight, Kellen looked back toward her cabin, his wolf stirring beneath his skin. The bond that tied them hummed faintly, alive, undeniable. And though he knew the truth would one day break the fragile peace they'd built, he couldn't bring himself to stay away. For both of them, silence had said too much already. Chapter 7. Secrets in the Moonlight. Snow dusted the ground like powdered sugar, turning the sleepy town of Ashbourne into a postcard scene no one had ordered. Harper watched the world outside her cafe window and tried, very unsuccessfully, not to think about Kellen. It was an impossible task. Even when he wasn't there, he somehow was. His jacket still hung on the hook by the door, his scent faint in the air. Pine. Smoke. Something darker that had no right to smell as good as it did. He'd been distant the past few days, disappearing into the woods for long stretches with vague explanations. She told herself it was fine. He wasn't hers, and she wasn't the type to pine over mysterious men who probably had entire forests of secrets. And yet, there she was, staring at the window, hoping he'd walk through the door like a scene from some dramatic movie. Lydia would definitely mock her for watching. As if summoned by the thought, the bell over the cafe door chimed. Kellen stepped inside, his hair damp with melted snow, cheeks touched by cold. He looked both too wild and too calm for this little town, and every head turned toward him as though gravity had shifted. Mrs. Calloway elbowed her friend and whispered something scandalous. Lydia, behind the counter, mouthed, "You're welcome," as if she had personally summoned him with matchmaking magic. Kellen's gaze found Harper instantly, and the rest of the world seemed to recede a little. He ordered coffee, though he didn't need to. She already knew how he took it. When she placed the mug in front of him, their fingers brushed. It was brief, but her pulse went off like someone had struck a match. He noticed, of course he did. His expression didn't change much, but his voice softened when he spoke. "You shouldn't be out late tonight." Harper frowned. "Why do you always sound like you're quoting a survival guide?" "The full moon," he said almost absently, like it explained everything. She laughed it off. "You make it sound ominous. What happens the wolves start paying property taxes?" The corner of his mouth twitched, and for once he didn't correct her. Instead, he looked away toward the snow gathering outside, his jaw tightening. Something about the silence that followed made Harper's humor falter. He wasn't joking. Whatever it was that lingered behind his calm facade, it was pulling at him tonight more than usual. When he left, she watched him go until the door closed, feeling that same strange tug in her chest, a mixture of worry and a pull she didn't have a name for. Lydia, of course, noticed immediately. "You're in love," Lydia announced, loud enough for the whole cafe to hear. Harper almost dropped the coffee pot. "I am not." Lydia just smiled like someone who'd read the end of the book before anyone else. "You're making hard eyes at him every morning, and now you're defending his mysterious midnight forest walks. Classic denial." Harper groaned, waving her off, but deep down she couldn't deny it anymore. There was something about Kellen, his quiet steadiness, the way he seemed to listen even when he said nothing. He made her feel grounded and dizzy all at once. That night the world outside felt alive again. The sky was silvered with the kind of moonlight that made everything seem too sharp, too vivid. Harper was locking the cafe when she heard it. the faint echo of a howl, distant but unmistakable. It sent a shiver down her spine, half fear, half something else entirely. She should have gone straight home. Instead, her curiosity, ever stronger than her good sense, led her down the path toward the woods. The air grew colder with each step, the snow crunching softly beneath her boots. Somewhere ahead, branches cracked and she froze. For a heartbeat she saw movement, a flash of silver fur, a shape gliding between trees too large to be real. Then it was gone. Her breath caught. Logic tried to reason its way through what she'd seen. Maybe it was a trick of light. Maybe she was tired. But her instincts whispered something wilder. And then he appeared, Kellen stepping out from the shadows, hair mussed, eyes catching the moonlight in a way that made her chest tighten. He didn't look surprised to see her, only resigned. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly. "You say that a lot," she replied, trying to steady her voice. "What's in there, Kellen? What are you hiding?" He hesitated, his silence stretched heavy as snow-laden branches. Then he stepped closer, close enough for her to see the faint shimmer in his gaze again, the one that wasn't human. The world felt suspended between heartbeats. "There are things about me," he said softly, "that you wouldn't believe." "Try me," she whispered, though her pulse was roaring in her ears. He smiled faintly, sad and fond all at once. "You always say that right before danger finds you." Harper wanted to push him, demand truth, but something about his tone stilled her. She didn't understand what he was, not yet, but for some reason, she trusted him. That realization scared her more than the sound she'd heard in the woods. When she finally turned back toward the path, she could feel his gaze following her, warm against the back of her neck. Part of her wanted him to stop her, to confess whatever secret kept his eyes so guarded. But he didn't. He only whispered something low that the wind almost carried away. "Stay safe, little human." She didn't hear him, not clearly. But later, lying awake in bed, that same voice echoed faintly in her dreams, deep, steady, threaded through the sound of distant howls. And for the first time, Harper realized the truth wasn't something she wanted to uncover anymore. It was something she wanted him to trust her with. Chapter 8. What the Night Revealed. Morning broke reluctantly, the kind of gray winter light that blurred everything into quiet tones. Harper hadn't slept much, her dreams haunted by flashes of silver fur and the memory of Kellen's voice. Low, careful, threaded with something almost sorrowful. She moved through her kitchen in a daze, burning her toast twice and nearly watering her coffee instead of her plants. Lydia, of course, noticed immediately when she arrived to help open the cafe. "You're doing that thing again," Lydia said, leaning against the counter with her arms folded. "The thing where you pretend you're fine while your face screams, 'I've just witnessed